Pushing open the meeting room door, I found my team gathered around a blue frosted cake reading Goodbye Forever. They raised their glasses, laughing and toasting to my supposed exile like a loser erased from the company map. But the real danger wasn't their blatant cruelty. It was that nobody in that room actually knew where I was being transferred. Come Monday morning, they would pay the price for never bothering to check the facts. My name is Savannah Wright. I am 36 years old, and up until this exact moment, I believed there was an upper limit to how boldly corporate cruelty could be displayed in broad daylight. It is 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. The fluorescent lights of the Varello Living Systems regional office buzz with that low, persistent hum that usually signals the end of a grueling week. I am walking down the main corridor, clutching a dark leather portfolio containing the final audit numbers for the quarter. I had been summoned to the main conference room for what my calendar called a critical strategy alignment sync. I should have known better. At Varello, strategy is just a polite word for theater. I push open the heavy glass door, expecting to see a whiteboard covered in meaningless synergistic buzzwords. Instead, I step into an ambush painted in neon frosting and fake smiles. The air in the room is thick, practically vibrating with an unnatural, malicious glee. My entire team, the Member Continuity Strategy Division, is standing in a tight semicircle around the long mahogany table. At the center sits a massive sheet cake, slathered in an offensive shade of bright blue icing. Piped across the top in jagged, mocking red letters are two words, Goodbye Forever. I stop just inside the doorframe. The door clicks shut behind me, sealing me inside. My eyes scan the room, taking in the scene like a slow-motion camera panning across a multi-car pileup. It is not just the cake. They have gone to extraordinary lengths to construct this shrine of humiliation. Behind them, taped firmly to the expensive frosted glass of the presentation board, is a sprawling collage of printed memes, mocked-up charts, and candid photos. There is a poorly lit picture of me squinting at a dual-monitor setup, plastered with bold impact font reading "Too principled to function." Another photo shows me raising a hand during a town hall meeting. Captioned, "Hold on, let me kill the vibe with some data." They have printed out old emails where I highlighted budget discrepancies, framing them with sad face emojis. There are dozens of these artifacts. They have taken my insistence on accuracy, my absolute refusal to rubber stamp their empty, fraudulent metrics, and turned it into a grotesque gallery of inside jokes. Marjorie Keene, our team lead, stands triumphantly at the head of the table. She is holding a plastic champagne flute filled with cheap, bubbling apple cider. Her signature cream-colored blazer is draped perfectly over her shoulders, her posture radiating absolute dominance. Her smile is sharp enough to cut glass. Marjorie does not just want me gone. She wants me publicly broken. She wants to watch my spirit snap in real time, surrounded by the people she has trained to despise me. "Savannah," Marjorie sings out, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that entirely fails to mask the venom underneath. "You made it. We were starting to worry you got lost in one of your depressing spreadsheets. Come in, come in. We are celebrating." She raises her plastic cup high in the air. The rest of the room immediately follows suit, a synchronized army of sycophants. "To Savannah," Marjorie announces, projecting her voice so it echoes off the acoustic ceiling panels. "We all know that maintaining the vibrant, dynamic Varello culture is our absolute top priority. We need visionaries. We need storytellers. Sometimes, people just do not fit that mold. They hold us back. And thankfully, upper management finally realized it is time to put culture misfits in their proper place. We wish you nothing but the absolute best on your exciting new journey to the bottom." A chorus of laughter erupts from the team. It is loud, sharp, and entirely devoid of human empathy. These are people I have sat next to for 3 grueling years. These are the people whose failing a disastrous campaigns I have quietly fixed at 2 o'clock in the morning so the department would not face a massive corporate audit. Delia Cross steps forward, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. She leans casually against the edge of the mahogany table, crossing her arms. I am really going to miss your weekly reminders about compliance regulations. Savannah. Honestly, who is going to tell us that our creative vision is statistically improbable now? Who is going to ruin the brainstorming sessions? Yeah, Grant Mercer chimes in, adjusting his tailored French cuffs. Grant has never read a raw data report. He did not immediately try to manipulate or hide. Remember the summer activation campaign? We had that massive, beautiful launch party planned, and Savannah literally tried to shut the whole thing down because the return on investment projections were -5%. -5%. Who cares about the math when the optics look that incredibly good? You have zero vision. She almost ruined the whole third quarter, Kelsey Bloom adds, shaking her head in a theatrical display of mock pity. Always so obsessed with the numbers, so paranoid about the risk factors, you never understood the story we were trying to tell. Savannah, you were always just dragging us down into the mud with your little rules and your endless warnings. They take turns taking shots at me. Each insult is delivered like a badge of honor, a public testament to how perfectly they have aligned themselves with Marjorie's toxic regime of style over substance. They are a team of corporate illusionists building massive houses out of thin paper, and they despise me because I am the only one holding a flashlight, pointing out the matches they are playing with. I know exactly what they are celebrating. The rumor mill in this regional office is a perfectly tuned machine. By Tuesday morning, everyone in the building knew I was being involuntarily transferred to the Juniper Falls Service Annex. In the vast, sprawling Varello ecosystem, Juniper Falls is not just a branch office, it is a corporate graveyard. It is a windowless, concrete basement operation located 4 states away, dealing exclusively with legacy software troubleshooting. It is where the company sends employees who are too tenured to fire easily, but too difficult to manage or manipulate. It is a black hole where careers go to quietly expire in obscurity. They believe I have been permanently exiled. They think I have been stripped of my rank, my voice, and my professional future. They are looking at me with hungry, predatory eyes. They desperately want the emotional payoff. They want to see the crushing realization wash over my face. They want my voice to tremble. They want me to argue, to desperately defend my work, to yell about how unfair the system is, or better yet, to break down and cry right here on the carpet. Marjorie's eyes are wide, practically begging for a hysterical reaction she can gossip about at happy hour for the next 6 months. I feel the heat rising in my chest, the instinctual, burning human urge to fight back against this public degradation. I want to scream at them that their numbers are entirely fake, that their entire division is a house of cards waiting for a strong breeze, but I do not let the heat reach my face. I force my breathing to slow down to a steady, rhythmic count. I lock my jaw. I build an impenetrable fortress around my expressions. I do not say a single word. I simply walk forward. The sea of gloating colleagues parts slightly as I approach the table. Marjorie's triumphant smile falters for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting nervously as she tries to calculate what I'm doing. I reach out and pick up a small, flimsy paper plate holding a jaggedly cut slice of the blue cake. The frosting on this particular piece spells out the letters "ever" from the word forever. I hold the plate in my right hand. I look down at the cheap, sugary mess, the artificial blue dye bleeding into the vanilla sponge. Then, I slowly look up. I look directly at Kelsey, who suddenly stops giggling and nervously averts her eyes to the floor. I look at Grant, who shifts his weight uncomfortably under my deadpan gaze, suddenly fascinated by his own shoes. I look at Delia, whose smug expression tightens into a hard, defensive line. Finally, I look at Marjorie. I stare directly into her eyes. I do not blink. I memorize the exact shade of arrogant triumph on her face. I commit this entire room to my permanent memory, the sickly sweet smell of the cider, the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights bouncing off the glass board, the sound of their shallow, shifting breathing. I do not defend my work. The data does not need my defense. It is completely immutable, and it is already in motion. I do not tell them they are wrong. Let them live in their comfortable, fragile delusion for just a little while longer. The longer they celebrate, the harder the concrete will feel when they finally hit it. I slowly lower my hand and place the untouched plate of cake back onto the table. The soft thud of the cardboard against the heavy mahogany sounds incredibly loud in the suddenly dead quiet room. I turn my back to the table and begin walking toward the glass door. The silence stretches behind me, heavy, confused, and suffocating. They did not get their explosion. They did not get their tears. They got a ghost. I place my hand on the cold metal handle of the door. I pause, just for a second. Standing in the threshold with my back still turned to them, I keep my voice entirely flat, entirely calm, and lower than usual, forcing every single one of them to lean in and strain to hear it. I think everyone should be on time this Monday. I push the door open and walk out, leaving the heavy glass to swing shut behind me with a solid, definitive click. Even from the empty hallway, I can feel the sudden, chilling drop in the conference room's temperature. The laughter has completely died, the pathetic little party is over, and the clock has just started ticking. I am an architect of invisible things. In the loud, aggressively extroverted world of modern corporate America, I have always been the person who prefers the quiet architecture of a well-built system. I do not fight for the microphone in crowded conference rooms. I do not deliver impassioned, empty speeches about corporate synergy. I sit in the back. I observe the shifting dynamics, and I build safety nets. My official title sits within the Member Continuity Strategy Division. In plain terms, my job is to figure out exactly why our clients cancel their subscriptions and to stop the bleeding before it tanks the quarterly earnings reports. It requires digging through massive amounts of user friction data, mapping risk models, and facing uncomfortable truths. It is a job that demands absolute objectivity. That is exactly what I was known for before I ever set foot inside Varello. 5 years ago, I worked for a rapidly scaling logistics firm that was hemorrhaging its most valuable accounts. Their retention department was a chaotic mess of ping-pong tables, free cold brew on tap, and absolutely zero structural discipline. They were trying to fix structural leaks with positive affirmations. I came in and stripped away every single layer of performative nonsense. I implemented rigid workflows, demanded clean, verifiable data, and cut out the endless cycle of meaningless brainstorming sessions. Within 18 months, we secured the highest client retention rate in the entire Eastern region. That reputation for ruthless efficiency was supposed to be my armor when Varello heavily recruited me. But I quickly learned that Varello is a completely different beast, and my department, specifically under the leadership of Marjorie Keene, operates under a terrifyingly different set of physics. Under Marjorie, the Member Continuity Division does not function as a strategic business unit. It functions strictly as a stage play. In her world, the underlying mechanics do not matter at all. The culture dictates that whoever tells the most compelling, emotionally resonant story wins the budget and the praise, even if the data supporting that story is completely rotting from the inside out. It is a culture of toxic positivity, where acknowledging a flaw is treated as a personal betrayal. Surviving in this environment meant watching my own work be cannibalized on a regular basis. The theft was rarely overt. It was executed with a polished, gaslighting subtlety that leaves you questioning your own sanity. I would spend 3 entire weeks compiling a structural risk assessment, pulling thousands of rows of raw user data to map out exactly why our current engagement loop was failing. I would bring the dense, heavily researched file into a one-on-one meeting with Marjorie. She would barely glance at the executive summary before pushing it back across the desk, her nose wrinkling in mild distaste. "It is just too cold. Savannah," she would say, adopting a tone of maternal disappointment. "It is too analytical. It feels heavy. We need heart in this department. We need narrative. Let us just table this for now until you can find the human element." I would walk out feeling completely defeated, instructed to bury the research. Then, exactly 3 weeks later, I would be sitting in a massive all-hands meeting. The projector would flash to life, and there, rendered in soft pastel colors and loaded with flowery, meaningless buzzwords, would be my exact structural model. It would be retitled something absurd like the Member Journey Embrace. Marjorie would stand at the front of the room, beaming, presenting the framework as a sudden epiphany she experienced over her weekend retreat. This became the established rhythm of my existence. When one of these repackaged, highly decorated campaigns succeeded on the surface, Delia and Grant were the ones popping cheap champagne, heavily credited for their brilliant strategic vision. But the undeniable math always catches up when the underlying metrics inevitably collapsed 4 months later, when the churn rate spiked exactly the way my original buried data had predicted the narrative would instantly shift. The spotlight would pivot, and my name would be violently pulled from the shadows. Savannah simply did not provide enough back-end operational support. Marjorie would report to the upper executives. The data team failed to capture the emotional nuances of the creative vision. She just struggles to support the overall team spirit. The isolation that followed was not an accident. It was a carefully curated, systematic punishment designed to force me out. It started with small, petty exclusions. I would walk into the break room at noon and realize the entire pod had gone out for a 2-hour lunch without mentioning a word of it to me. I would return to my desk to find photos of their cocktails already posted on the internal social feed. Then, the exclusion escalated to the actual workflow. Crucial, high-stakes decisions were suddenly being made in impromptu, off-calendar hallway chats that I was never invited to. I would receive a brief, casual email at 5 o'clock on a Thursday evening, mentioning a massive pivot in our core strategy, a pivot that I was suddenly and exclusively responsible for executing by Monday morning. I was intentionally being starved of context, kept completely in the dark so that I would constantly stumble and fail. They wanted me to look incompetent. Gaslighting in corporate America does not happen in a dark room. It happens under bright, eco-friendly lighting. It happens over catered salads. It is designed to make you react emotionally so they can finally label you as the hysterical, difficult woman they already claim you are. They desperately wanted me to break. They wanted an angry, unhinged email they could forward to human resources. They wanted me to yell in a meeting so they could write me up for creating a hostile environment. I gave them absolutely nothing. I swallowed my pride, locked my jaw, and became a digital ghost. Instead of fighting back with emotion, I began to quietly build an impenetrable fortress of facts. I created my own shadow archiving system. Every single time a shared document was altered, I downloaded the original version and saved it to an encrypted drive with a clean, verifiable timestamp. Every time Marjorie or Grant gave me a vague, contradictory verbal directive in the hallway to avoid a paper trail, I immediately went back to my desk and sent an email summarizing the exact conversation, explicitly asking for confirmation. I filed their inevitably evasive, non-committal replies in a locked local folder. I downloaded the raw data pulls directly from the mainframe every Friday at 6 o'clock, before Grant had the opportunity to manipulate the formulas over the weekend. I kept detailed, aggressively objective notes of every single meeting, documenting exactly who proposed what idea, who rejected the risk warnings, and what the original projections were. I did not rely on my memory. I relied on metadata. I spent my evenings sitting alone at my small kitchen table, the silence of my apartment a stark contrast to the aggressive, performative buzz of the office. I would drink black tea and systematically organize my files, cross-referencing emails with version histories. I was mapping the entire anatomy of their fraud. They called me rigid behind my back. They called me obsessed and difficult. But sitting in those meetings, watching them perform for each other, I finally realized the actual truth. The core reason my team hated me was not because I was weak, and it was not because I lacked their polished charm. They hated me because I functioned as a mirror they could not shatter. In a department built entirely on smoke, mirrors, and collective delusion, I was the only person keeping a permanent ledger. They could smile, hand out awards, and compliment each other's fake numbers all day long, but they knew that I knew the truth. They could feel my silent, unblinking awareness tracking their every move. They vaguely sensed that I saw them exactly for what they were, terrified frauds playing dress-up in corporate attire. And that quiet, undocumented knowledge terrified them far more than anything I could have ever shouted in a boardroom. The fuse for this entire explosive situation was lit 6 months ago, during the rollout of our division's most ambitious initiative of the fiscal year. They called it the Silent Renewal Path. The name itself sounded like a peaceful meditation retreat, but the actual mechanics were essentially corporate extortion. It was a retention strategy designed to artificially inflate our subscriber numbers by making it aggressively difficult for users to cancel their contracts. If a client clicked the cancellation button on our web portal, they were not taken to a confirmation page. Instead, they were trapped in a labyrinth of dark patterns. They were forced to click through 5 different hidden menus, offered confusing, auto-enrolling discount loops, and subjected to deliberate, systemic delays in refund processing. It was a highly unethical trap, designed to wear the customer down until they simply gave up and accepted another month of automatic billing. When the initial framework was proposed, I spent 72 straight hours running stress tests on the proposed architecture. I pulled historical behavioral data and ran predictive models. The results were absolutely terrifying. I compiled my findings into a comprehensive dossier and presented it during our weekly alignment sync in the main boardroom. "This model is a ticking time bomb," I explained to the room, keeping my tone perfectly even and my hands flat on the table. "By delaying the offboarding process and forcing these friction loops, we are going to see a short-term spike in retained revenue. But my projections show that within 90 days, our customer support complaint volume will increase by over 400%. When a customer realizes they have been billed for 3 consecutive months after trying to cancel, they do not just complain, they initiate hostile chargebacks through their banks. Every single chargeback slaps Varello with a $35 penalty fee, completely separate from the refunded subscription cost. The post-processing costs to handle these disputes will completely wipe out any immediate financial gains. More importantly, we are going to burn our bridges with our enterprise-level clients. Hale Winter Collective will drop us before Q4 if we subject their subsidiary accounts to this maze." Marjorie leaned back in her ergonomic chair, steepling her perfectly manicured fingers. She looked at me with an expression of performative exhaustion, the exact look a parent gives a toddler who refuses to understand a simple concept. "Savannah," Marjorie sighed, shaking her head dramatically. "This is exactly what we talk about every single quarter. You are not seeing the vision. You are looking at a brilliant, sticky retention loop and finding a way to make it sound like a federal crime scene. What you just gave us is simply fear presented in spreadsheet format. We need bold action right now, not paralysis by analysis." She dismissed my entire 70-page risk assessment with a single, careless wave of her hand. The rest of the table chuckled dutifully, Grant rolled his eyes, and Delia actually mimed falling asleep against her notebook. I closed my laptop and said nothing. I knew the math was right. The math does not care about your creative vision. Less than 48 hours later, the breathtaking audacity of their operation truly revealed itself. I was sitting in the back row of a quarterly review presentation when a slide flashed onto the projector screen that made my blood run completely cold. Delia and Grant were standing at the podium, proudly presenting a new predictive mitigation model to the regional director. I stared at the screen, my jaw clenching. It was my work. They had taken the second section of my risk dossier, the exact model I had built to show how the system would collapse, and violently stripped out all the warnings. They altered the terminology, changing my phrase, systematic failure cascade, to cascading opportunity matrix. They slapped a bright, cheerful color palette over my graphs and presented my structural analysis as their own brilliant roadmap for managing the acceptable friction of the new program. They had stolen the engine of my car to power their own execution block. The silent renewal path launched exactly on schedule. For the first 60 days, it was a massive, blinding success. Marjorie paraded the artificially inflated retention numbers around the regional office like a championship trophy. She secured a massive bonus pool for the leadership team. Delia and Grant were suddenly giving internal seminars on innovative customer journeys. Marjorie used this superficial victory to cement her absolute authority over the regional operations, actively silencing anyone who dared to question her methods. But right on schedule, exactly as my buried model had predicted, the foundation began to crack. Around day 85, the anomaly reports started trickling in. The legal department flagged a sudden, massive surge in credit card chargebacks. The customer service queues began to overflow with furious clients who had been unknowingly locked into automatic renewals. The back-end operational costs to manually untangle the mess started bleeding deep into the red. The short-term sugar rush was wearing off, and the company was heading straight into an operational collapse. And that is exactly when the blame shifting began. It was a slow, deliberate, and highly calculated pivot. When regional directors asked why the operational costs were skyrocketing, Marjorie did not blame the program. She blamed the execution of the data tracking. "We are experiencing some temporary reporting lag due to Savannah's back-end pipeline," Marjorie noted casually in a highly circulated regional memo. "The data team is struggling to keep up with the incredible volume of our success. We are coaching her through these operational bottlenecks to ensure she can support the broader vision." I realized then that this was no longer just petty office politics. My team was not simply bullying me. They were actively gambling with the future of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. They were deliberately doctoring metrics, hiding catastrophic financial liabilities, and preparing to use me as the absolute fall guy when the entire structure inevitably collapsed. They were building a massive fraud, and my name was being slowly, methodically carved into the bedrock of their lies. I knew I had to act, but I also knew that raising a flag locally would be professional suicide. Marjorie controlled the regional narrative completely. If I went to the local human resources representative, the complaint would be intercepted, buried, and framed as the desperate retaliation of an underperforming, disgruntled employee. Then, on a Tuesday morning, a silent, extraordinary event occurred. I was at my desk, watching the chargeback numbers climb in real time on my secondary monitor, when a single unadorned email arrived in my secure inbox. It did not come from the regional domain. It came directly from the executive floor of the central headquarters, located halfway across the country. The sender was the Chief of Staff for the Enterprise Continuity Command, an elite, highly secretive auditing division that operated entirely outside the standard corporate hierarchy. The subject line contained only a string of internal project codes. The body of the email was a highly confidential calendar invitation for a secure encrypted video conference set for the following week. Attached to the invitation was a heavily encrypted file containing my original, unaltered risk assessment for the silent renewal path. The exact one Marjorie had dismissed and Delia had cannibalized. The message simply asked me to be prepared to verify the origins of the document. I sat perfectly still, the blue glow of the monitors reflecting off my glasses. The central nervous system of Varelo had bypassed the regional managers completely and reached directly down to the basement to find the leak. I accepted the invitation. I did not breathe a single word of it to anyone. I maintained my usual routine. I attended the miserable daily stand-up meetings. I endured Grant's condescending remarks about my typing speed. I allowed Delia to take credit for another one of my workflow optimizations. I became an absolute vault, but secrets in a corporate environment emit a certain frequency. People notice when your anxiety drops. They notice when you stop fighting back. The lack of a reaction makes them deeply uncomfortable, so their minds rush to fill the void with their own arrogant assumptions. Within a week, Marjorie had noticed a shift in the corporate directory routing related to my employee identification number. The system had flagged my profile for an impending administrative transfer, a standard security protocol before an executive-level transition. Marjorie, operating on a diet of pure arrogance and assumption, connected the dots to the only destination she believed I deserved. She assumed her endless paper trail of negative performance reviews had finally triggered an automatic exile to the Juniper Falls Service Annex. She whispered it to Delia. Delia texted it to Grant. By Friday, The entire floor was buzzing with the news of my supposed demise. I let the rumor bloom like a poisonous flower. I watched them build their own false reality, laying the bricks of their own destruction with breathless enthusiasm. Their blind, unshakable confidence was their ultimate undoing. They were so utterly convinced of their own superiority, so certain that the system existed solely to protect people like them, that they committed the most fatal error in any corporate war. They assumed the battle was over, and they decided to throw a party. They were celebrating a total victory while standing directly on top of a landmine, completely unaware that I was the one holding the detonator in my pocket. The reality of that encrypted video call was a stark contrast to the neon-frosted circus of my regional office. Exactly 5 days before that tragic little cake party, my primary monitor had flickered to life in a heavily secured virtual conference room. There were no fake pleasantries. There was no discussion about synergies or finding the emotional core of our brand journey. There were exactly 3 people on the screen. 2 of them were senior forensic analysts for the Enterprise Continuity Command, looking deeply exhausted in their stark white offices. Sitting precisely in the center frame was Lenora Voss. Lenora was the Chief Operating Officer of Varello Living Systems. She was an absolute legend within the corporate infrastructure, a woman who had systematically dismantled and rebuilt 3 failing divisions over the past 10 years. She did not raise her voice. She did not smile to make people comfortable. She dealt exclusively in verified reality. "Savannah," Lenora had started, her voice a sharp, clinical instrument. "We have been monitoring the regional variance logs for the past 6 months. The discrepancy between the revenue projected by your team lead and the actual cash retention is staggering. We initiated a silent audit of the entire Member Continuity Strategy Division 30 days ago." I sat perfectly still in my chair, keeping my expression entirely neutral. One of the analysts leaned forward, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "We pulled the server backups, not the sanitized dashboards Marjorie submits to the board, but the raw data layers. We found your original risk assessment for the retention program, the one that predicted a catastrophic failure cascade within 90 days. We also found the modified version submitted by your colleagues a week later, where your warnings were entirely scrubbed and repackaged as a growth matrix." They knew absolutely everything. They had bypassed the middle management completely and gone straight into the digital bones of the building. "The regional directors believe you are the primary bottleneck," Lenora continued, her eyes locking onto mine through the high-definition lens. "They have filed 12 separate internal complaints over the last year labeling you as uncooperative, negative, and a severe detriment to their creative process. But looking at the actual metadata, I see something completely different. I see an employee who is entirely immune to the political theater. You are the only person in that entire building who actually understands how our system is breaking. And more importantly, you are the only one not addicted to the poisonous game they are playing." Lenora did not offer me a meaningless apology for my suffering. She offered me a weapon. "We are initiating a massive structural purge of the regional leadership starting next week," Lenora stated flatly. "I do not want to promote you locally. That would be a complete waste of your analytical capacity, and it would tip them off before we have secured the perimeters. I am transferring you directly into my unit. You are being absorbed into the Enterprise Continuity Command." The weight of that sentence was immense. The command was the absolute apex of corporate authority at Varello. It was the internal investigative branch that had the unilateral power to freeze budgets, override regional directors, and terminate entire departments without warning or appeal. "Your new title will be Director of Enterprise Continuity," Lenora explained, pulling up a secondary file on her screen. "You will have full administrative override. You will be responsible for reviewing every single role, every single budget, and every single project within your former division. You will decide who survives the restructuring and who is permanently cut from the organization." There was a crucial logistical catch. Because the restructuring involved thousands of employees across 4 different states, the operation required total secrecy until the official deployment date. My new clearance level and title had to remain highly classified for 72 hours. During that window, the automated human resources system would only show my profile as flagged for an administrative transfer out of the department, stripping away my local access to maintain the illusion. "They will assume you are being fired or exiled," Lenora warned me, her tone devoid of any sympathy or softness. "Can you handle the local fallout for 3 days without breaking protocol?" "I can," I replied instantly. "But I have one operational request. Do not correct the rumors. Let them believe they won. Let them think I am being shipped off to the legacy support basement." Lenora's eyebrow arched slightly, the closest she ever came to showing amusement. "And why would we allow a false narrative to circulate on our internal networks?" "Because," I said, my voice steady and cold, "when people believe they have entirely eliminated their only threat, they stop pretending. They will show you exactly how they intend to run the division when no one is watching. It will provide the final behavioral data we need for the restructure." Lenora had agreed without hesitation. And so, the trap was officially armed. That was the secret context behind the grotesque celebration I had just walked away from. When I looked at that bright blue cake and listened to Delia and Grant mock my insistence on the rules, I did not feel humiliated. I felt an absolute, profound sense of validation. They thought they were roasting a defeated enemy. In reality, they were eagerly volunteering to provide live, irrefutable evidence of the exact cultural rot Lenora had hired me to burn to the ground. Their arrogant little party was not my funeral. It was their signed confession. The weekend that followed was not spent in misery. I did not sit on my couch eating ice cream and mourning my toxic workplace. I did not complain to my friends or post vague, passive-aggressive quotes on social media. I shut out the world completely. I sat at the small, glass dining table in my apartment, bathed in the sharp glow of 2 large external monitors. I brewed a large pot of dark roast coffee and began to systematically pull apart the anatomy of my former team. With my newly activated executive credentials, I bypassed every single firewall in the regional network. The access was breathtaking. I could see the hidden communication channels. I could see the precise, second-by-second edit history of the quarterly financial reports. I watched as Grant artificially inflated the engagement metrics by 25%, just hours before a major presentation to the board. I found a hidden folder deep in the shared drive where Delia had saved 3 years' worth of my strategic proposals, slowly feeding them to Marjorie as her own brilliant ideas. I mapped out the entire power structure of the regional office, tracing exactly how Marjorie had built a fortress of incompetent loyalists while aggressively pushing out anyone who questioned the math. I reviewed the performance appraisals of the quiet, overworked junior analysts. I spent 2 hours reading the logs of Iris Boone, a brilliant young specialist who did all the heavy lifting while Delia routinely took all the credit. I was redesigning the entire chessboard. I was stripping away the protective layers of corporate jargon and exposing the raw, undeniable incompetence underneath. I drafted the severance packages for the primary offenders. I drew up the new operational protocols that would govern the survivors. I set up the tracking mechanisms that would make their fraudulent reporting methods completely impossible moving forward. I calculated the exact financial damage their vanity projects had caused, preparing a ledger of failure that no amount of smooth talking could ever erase. By Sunday night at 11 o'clock, the entire blueprint was finished. The silence of my apartment felt different now. It was no longer the silence of isolation. It was the heavy, loaded silence right before a massive storm makes landfall. I closed my laptop and packed my dark leather portfolio. I laid out a sharp, impeccably tailored black suit for the morning. My former colleagues were likely asleep right now, resting comfortably in their smug delusion, believing that Monday morning would bring them a workspace entirely free of my inconvenient truths. They thought they had successfully pushed me off the board and won the game. They had absolutely no idea that I was the one who now owned the entire table, and I was about to flip it completely upside down. Monday morning arrived with a sharp, biting chill in the air. Instead of taking the familiar, depressing highway exit toward the regional branch, My car headed seamlessly into the polished underground garage of the central headquarters. The air down here smelled of high-grade ozone and expensive floor wax. I rode the private executive elevator upward, the numbers ticking past the standard operational floors, bypassing the middle management tiers entirely, and finally chiming softly as I reached the restricted apex of the building. The doors slid open, revealing a fortress of soundproof glass, brushed steel, and hushed, focused energy. There were no neon signs. There were no motivational posters taped to the walls. It was an environment built strictly for absolute authority. I walked down the long, immaculate corridor until I found the suite Lenora Voss had prepared for me. I stopped in front of the heavy glass door. Etched into the frosted surface in crisp, minimalist lettering was my name, followed immediately by my new reality, Savannah Wright, Director of Enterprise Continuity. I pushed the door open. The office was vast, overlooking the sprawling city skyline, but I did not waste a single second admiring the view. I placed my leather portfolio on the sprawling oak desk, opened my laptop, and began the final preparations. The clock on the wall was inching closer to 9 o'clock in the morning, 10 minutes before the hour. I left my private office and walked into the primary executive communications room. Lenora was already there, standing quietly near the massive wall-sized digital display. She offered a single, firm nod as I entered. We did not exchange pleasantries. The time for strategy was over. This was the execution phase. I took my seat at the exact center of the long, polished mahogany table. I smoothed out the lapels of my tailored black suit. I focused my breathing, ensuring my heart rate remained perfectly steady. I was not here to seek emotional vengeance. I was here to deliver a structural reckoning. On the regional side, an automated calendar invitation had been placed on the schedules of every single employee in Marjorie Keene's division late Sunday night. The subject line was deliberately vague, titled only as a mandatory introduction to the new restructuring oversight unit. They had absolutely no idea who would be on the other end of the feed. At exactly 9 o'clock, the connection was established. The massive display in front of me flickered, and suddenly, I was looking directly into the familiar, cramped confines of the regional conference room. The camera angle captured the entire team. They were sitting around the same table where my grotesque farewell cake had rested just 72 hours prior. Marjorie was at the head of their table, sipping a latte and checking her phone, radiating her usual brand of bored arrogance. Grant was leaning back in his chair, whispering something to Delia that made her smirk. Kelsey was mindlessly clicking a pen. They looked entirely unbothered, expecting a routine corporate lecture from a faceless human resources representative. Then, the two-way video feed fully engaged, projecting my image onto the large screen in their room. The transformation was instantaneous and physically violent. Marjorie dropped her phone onto the table with a sharp clatter. Grant abruptly stopped whispering, his jaw literally dropping open as he sat bolt upright in his chair. Delia lost all the color in her face, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated panic. The entire room froze, perfectly paralyzed. They saw the high-definition feed. They saw the expansive, multi-million-dollar executive boardroom behind me. They saw Lenora Voss, the chief operating officer of the entire corporation, standing silently in the background like a shadow. And most importantly, they saw me. I was not sitting in a windowless basement in Juniper Falls. I was looking down at them from the highest peak of the corporate mountain. The silence stretching across the network connection was deafening. It was the sound of 20 people simultaneously realizing that their entire reality had just shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Lenora stepped forward, her voice cutting through the dead air like a scalpel. "Good morning," Lenora said, her tone devoid of any warmth. "As you are all aware, Virello Living Systems is entering a period of aggressive restructuring. To ensure absolute compliance and operational integrity across all regional branches, the Executive Board has activated the Enterprise Continuity Command. I will now hand the floor over to the director of this unit to outline the new operational parameters." Lenora stepped back, leaving me in total control of the frame. I looked directly into the camera lens. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I let the silence hang for another 5 seconds, forcing them to marinate in their own rising terror. "My name is Savannah Wright," I began, my voice deliberately flat and perfectly modulated. "I am the Director of Enterprise Continuity, effective immediately. Your entire division is now under my direct operational jurisdiction." I watched Marjorie swallow hard, her throat visibly bobbing. She opened her mouth as if to speak, perhaps to try and salvage the situation with her usual sycophantic charm, but she could not find a single word. The oxygen had been entirely sucked out of her lungs. "Starting today, the Member Continuity Strategy Department will enter a mandatory 30-day structural review period," I continued, reading from a prepared document, never breaking eye contact with the camera. "During this window, all localized autonomy is officially suspended. Every single external communication, every marketing expenditure, and every proposed workflow adjustment must be routed directly through my office for forensic approval." I paused, letting the weight of the new reality crush them. "Furthermore," I stated, my tone dropping a fraction of an octave, "all regional administrative privileges have been revoked. You no longer have the ability to alter past performance metrics, modify shared data drives, or finalize personnel reviews without my explicit time-stamped authorization. My team has already secured a complete mirror backup of your servers as they existed at midnight on Friday." That specific detail hit them like a physical blow. Grant physically flinched. Delia looked sick to her stomach. They knew exactly what was on those servers. They knew I now possessed the unaltered history of their entire fraudulent operation. I did not mention the blue frosting. I did not say a single word about their cruel jokes or the fake champagne. Bringing up the party would have reduced this execution to a petty personal squabble. By keeping my demeanor strictly professional, I became an unknowable, terrifying force of nature. They had no idea how much I knew, how far back my evidence went, or exactly when I was going to drop the hammer. The psychological torture of the unknown was far more punishing than any immediate firing. "This review is not a formality," I concluded, leaning forward slightly, bringing my face closer to the camera. "The evaluation of your continued employment at Varello will be determined exclusively by verifiable, unmanipulated data. It will not be determined by team spirit. It will not be determined by the narrative you present in a slide deck. And it will certainly not be determined by who has the loudest voice in the room." I held my gaze on Marjorie for 3 long, agonizing seconds. She looked small, entirely stripped of her manufactured power. "I expect your preliminary compliance reports uploaded to the secure portal by 5 o'clock this evening," I said softly, delivering the final blow. "Have a highly productive Monday." I reached out and severed the connection. The massive screen in the executive boardroom immediately faded to black, cutting off the image of their pale, terrified faces. I stood up from the table, perfectly composed. I returned to the regional office on Wednesday morning at precisely 8:45. The elevator doors opened on the 4th floor, and the immediate sensation was a suffocating, unnatural silence. The usual aggressive hum of the Member Continuity Strategy Division had completely evaporated. Heads ducked behind monitors. Keyboards clattered with sudden, nervous intensity as I walked down the main aisle. I glanced at my old desk. It had been scrubbed completely clean. There was no trace of the blue frosting, no mocking printed memes, absolutely nothing to suggest that just a few days ago, it had been the site of my public execution. It was as if history had been frantically wiped away with a damp cloth. I walked straight into the main conference room. Marjorie Keene was already there, buzzing with a deeply unsettling, manic energy. She had transformed the long mahogany table into a pathetic peace offering. There were 2 silver carafes of artisanal coffee, a tiered platter of expensive French pastries, and neat stacks of color-printed agendas bound in glossy covers. Marjorie was wearing a soft beige cashmere sweater, clearly trying to project an aura of warm, collaborative, professional friendship. "Savannah," Marjorie said, her voice dripping with an artificial brightness that cracked slightly at the edges. "Welcome back. We are so incredibly thrilled to have you leading the transition. I ordered the dark roast you always used to drink, and I pulled together a high-level overview of our current synergy targets. She extended a glossy, bound packet toward me. I did not look at the coffee. I did not touch the pastries. I looked at the glossy packet for a single second before sliding it gently to the side of the table. We will not be reviewing synergy targets today. Marjorie, I said, my voice maintaining a calm, lethal evenness. I took my seat at the head of the table. The rest of the team filed in, taking their seats with the rigid stiffness of prisoners sitting before a military tribunal. Delia Cross looked like she had not slept in 3 days. Grant Mercer kept adjusting his tie, his usual swagger entirely missing. I opened my laptop. I am implementing a new operational framework effective immediately. It is called the Contribution Mapping Protocol. Moving forward, the concept of team ownership is officially suspended. Every single project, every campaign, and every client deliverable will now carry a mandatory digital watermark tracing its exact genesis. I looked around the table, watching the oxygen slowly leave the room. This means every document will clearly display exactly who generated the initial concept, who provided the raw data, who edited the copy, who approved the final version, and most importantly, who delayed the workflow. There will be no more shared credit for individual labor. There will be zero ambiguity regarding who is actually building our infrastructure. Marjorie forced a tight, brittle smile. That sounds like a very thorough tracking mechanism, Savannah, but we have always prided ourselves on our organic, collaborative spirit. I worry that reducing our creative flow to a rigid tracking system might stifle the natural magic of our brainstorming process. The magic is exactly what we are eliminating, I replied instantly, staring directly into her eyes. Because magic is an illusion, data is reality. I turned my attention away from Marjorie, shifting my gaze down the table. This was the moment they expected me to unleash my emotional vengeance. They expected me to scream, to humiliate Marjorie in front of her loyalists, to fire someone on the spot just to prove I could. They were bracing for a dramatic, fiery explosion. Instead, I gave them absolute, chilling fairness. "Iris!" I called out. At the far end of the table, Iris Boone physically jumped. She was a 24-year-old junior data analyst who had spent the last 2 years quietly building the brilliant predictive models that Delia routinely stole and presented as her own. Iris looked absolutely terrified, clutching her notepad to her chest. "Yes, Director Wright," Iris stammered. "Under the new protocol, you are no longer reporting through the creative tier," I stated cleanly. "Effective as of 9 o'clock this morning, you have been elevated to lead continuity architect for this region. You now have direct authorization over all initial data modeling. No campaign moves into the design phase without your verified digital signature on the raw metrics." Iris blinked, her mouth opening and closing silently. Delia let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, her head whipping around to stare at me. I had just taken Delia's primary source of stolen labor and placed her completely out of Delia's reach. I turned my focus to Grant. He was sweating visibly through his expensive dress shirt. Grant was the department's golden boy, the charismatic presenter who charmed clients while possessing absolutely zero understanding of the spreadsheets he was presenting. "Grant," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, "I am restructuring our client-facing representation. You are being permanently removed from all external pitch meetings and direct client communications." "Wait, what?" Grant blurted out, his voice cracking with panic. "Savannah, my client relationships are the absolute backbone of this division. You cannot pull me off the floor. I am the face of the renewal strategy." "You are a storyteller, Grant," I corrected him smoothly. "And right now, this company does not need stories. We need verifiable accuracy. Your new role is Senior Verification Officer. Your sole responsibility will be auditing the historical retention numbers from the past 18 months. You will mathematically prove every single digit you have presented to the board this year. You will not speak to a client until your ledger is perfectly balanced. If you find a discrepancy, you will explain it to me in writing." Grant slumped back in his chair, his face turning an ashen shade of gray. He knew the numbers were entirely fabricated. I had just locked him in a room with his own fraud and demanded he solve it. Next, I looked at Delia. She shrank back against the leather upholstery, trying to make herself as small as possible. "Delia," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, demanding register. "I need a comprehensive audit of the creative pipeline. By 5 o'clock on Friday, you will submit a full, time-stamped history of every major campaign idea generated in this department over the last 12 months. I want the original draft files, the initial email pitches, and the raw brainstorming notes. I need to see the exact evolutionary path of your concepts." Delia turned completely pale. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. "Savannah, that is a massive undertaking. The archives are incredibly disorganized. A lot of our early ideation was done verbally, just throwing things at the wall. I do not think I can produce the raw files for everything." "Then you will document the gaps," I replied coldly. "If an idea cannot be traced back to a specific author with digital proof, it will be classified as unverified. I expect the complete archive on my desk by Friday." I finally looked back at Marjorie. She was sitting completely frozen, her hands tightly gripping the edges of her glossy Synergy packet. She had prepared herself for a street fight. She had armed herself with corporate buzzwords and fake apologies, ready to defend against an emotional attack. But I had completely bypassed her defenses by simply instituting a meritocracy. I had created a cold, unforgiving system where people who climbed the ladder using pure nepotism and stolen labor suddenly found themselves in an environment with absolutely zero oxygen. They were suffocating on their own incompetence. "This is merely the operational verification phase," I announced to the painfully silent room, closing my laptop with a definitive snap. "We are establishing the baseline of truth. However, the final decision regarding the permanent existence of this department has not yet been made. That decision will be determined by your performance during a massive, high-stakes trial project launching next week. It is a critical recovery operation, and it will serve as your absolute final evaluation." I stood up, picking up my portfolio. I did not look at the pastries. I did not look back as I walked out the door. Every single step I took echoed loudly in the hallway, a steady drumbeat marching them directly toward their own unavoidable ruin. The initial shock did not last long. Corporate parasites like Marjorie Keene do not simply roll over and accept their demise. They adapt, they scheme, and they attempt to drag everyone else down into the mud with them. By Thursday afternoon, the paralysis had worn off, replaced by a frantic, subterranean guerrilla war. I sat in my glass-walled executive suite, overlooking the city skyline, watching the digital tripwires I had set up across the regional network light up one by one. The counterattack was exactly as clumsy and predictable as I had anticipated. It started with the whispers. Grant Mercer, stripped of his golden boy status and locked in a cubicle with a calculator, began cornering the neutral junior staff in the break room. He kept his voice low, adopting the tone of a concerned older brother sharing insider knowledge. "Listen to me," Grant murmured to a young marketing coordinator, completely unaware that I was later briefed on this exact conversation. "Savannah is just a temporary face. The executive floor needed a sacrificial lamb for this massive restructuring. As soon as this recovery project inevitably tanks in a couple of weeks, Lenora Voss is going to throw Savannah right under the bus. If you align yourself with her now, you are going down with the ship. Stick with Marjorie. She actually knows how to survive these corporate purges." While Grant played the hallway politician, Delia Cross attempted to rewrite history entirely. During a mandatory team sync that I monitored remotely, she casually seeded a completely fabricated narrative regarding the silent renewal path crisis. "It is just so funny how things change," Delia sighed, stirring her tea with exaggerated nonchalance. "I vividly remember Savannah pushing the aggressive auto-enrollment model during our ideation sessions last quarter. She said the math supported the risk. Now that the wind has shifted and the executives are upset, suddenly she is swooping in to play the hero and auditing us for the exact thing she originally championed. It is brilliant politics, honestly, but completely two-faced. But their most desperate move was playing out deep within the regional servers. My secondary monitor, dedicated entirely to tracking network anomalies, flashed a steady red warning. Someone with legacy administrative access was systematically marching through the shared departmental drive, permanently deleting the original, unedited strategy files related to the retention program. They were trying to bleach the crime scene before my forensic auditors could officially process the digital evidence. They honestly believed they were being stealthy. They did not realize that I was not just watching the house. I owned the blueprint, the locks, and the security cameras. Then came their masterstroke. On Friday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, an urgent, highly classified notification pinged my inbox from the Central Human Resources Ethics Portal. It was an anonymous formal grievance filed against me. The complaint was a masterpiece of corporate weaponized language. It accused the new director of enterprise continuity of possessing a severe conflict of interest, alleging that I was using a corporate restructuring mandate to execute a petty emotional vendetta against former colleagues who had previously outshone my performance. It formally requested an immediate injunction against my authority and an independent review of my personnel decisions. Marjorie had undoubtedly drafted it. It was her signature move, playing the victim while actively holding the knife. She hoped the bureaucracy of an ethics investigation would paralyze my momentum and buy her enough time to finish deleting the server history. I did not panic. I did not feel an ounce of stress. I smiled, took a sip of my black coffee, and prepared to close the steel jaws of the trap. They had fundamentally misunderstood the game. I was not playing reactively. I had moved my pieces into position months before they even knew we were sitting at a chessboard. Before I could formally submit my counter-evidence to the ethics committee, my secure office phone buzzed. It was Iris Boone. "Director Wright?" Iris said, her voice trembling slightly but laced with a newfound, steely resolve. "I need to show you something. I did not want to upload it to the main network because I know they are watching the traffic." 10 minutes later, Iris arrived in my suite. She handed me a thick, physical manila folder. I opened it and spread the contents across my mahogany desk. It was the holy grail of our department's dysfunction. Iris, the quiet analyst whom everyone ignored, had been taking meticulous verbatim shorthand notes during every single closed-door strategy meeting for the past 2 years. She had documented exactly how Marjorie had aggressively bullied the room into ignoring my initial risk models. She had direct quotes from Delia demanding that Iris manipulate the demographic data to make the client presentations look more favorable. When I saw the original files disappearing from the shared drive yesterday, Iris explained, standing tall before my desk, "I knew they were trying to frame you. They think because they hit delete, the history is gone. But they never realized I keep hard copies of my personal meeting minutes. Marjorie explicitly ordered us to bury your warnings about the chargeback ratios during the second week of October." I looked at Iris, feeling a profound sense of professional respect. I did not even need to use my own hidden archives yet. The system I had just empowered was already functioning perfectly to defend itself. "Thank you, Iris," I said softly. "This is exactly what the new Varello looks like." With Iris's physical logs added to my digital arsenal, I drafted my official response to the anonymous ethics complaint. I did not write a defensive, emotional essay. I simply attached a tightly organized data package. First, I included the server timestamp logs, proving that Marjorie's secure login credentials were used to mass delete company files at 2 o'clock in the morning. Then, I attached my own off-grid backups, the exact files she thought she had destroyed, complete with the metadata showing Delia's subsequent alterations. Next, I included Iris's verified meeting minutes, highlighting the exact moments Marjorie instructed the team to falsify the risk reports. Finally, I provided a rigid mathematical breakdown of every single personnel change I had made since Monday. I proved that Grant was removed from client relations not out of spite, but because his accounts had a 90% error rate in their financial reporting. I showed that Iris was promoted purely based on the fact that her models had generated the only legitimate, sustainable revenue the department had seen in 12 months. Every single action I took was flawlessly mapped to documented competence and historical performance. There was absolutely zero emotion. It was pure, unassailable logic. The ethics committee reviewed my response and dismissed Marjorie's anonymous complaint within 45 minutes. The dismissal notification was automatically copied to the regional leadership tier. When that email landed in their inboxes, the temperature in the regional office dropped to absolute zero. The truth finally crashed down on my former team, with the weight of a collapsing building. The frantic whispers in the break room stopped entirely. Delia ceased her storytelling. Grant stared blankly at his monitor, completely defeated. They finally understood the absolute inescapable horror of their situation. I did not just possess the new, terrifying power of the executive floor. I possessed the old receipts. I had the timestamps, the forwarded emails, the access logs, and the shadow files from every single day they thought they were getting away with their fraud. I had the sword of the company's future in one hand, and the shield of their unforgivable past in the other. And as the week drew to a close, they realized that those two things matched together perfectly, leaving them absolutely no room to run, no shadows to hide in, and nobody left to blame but themselves. The air in the boardroom felt fundamentally different by the middle of the second week. The petty squabbles and hallway gossip had been suffocated by the sheer, crushing weight of my new operational protocols. But keeping them terrified and isolated was merely the setup. It was time to pull back the curtain and show them the actual, terrifying size of the stage they were standing on. I initiated a mandatory all-hands video conference on Tuesday morning at exactly 10 o'clock. Every single member of the regional division was required to be on the call. Their faces arranged in a grid of nervous anticipation across my massive office monitor. Up until this exact moment, I began, my voice projecting cleanly through their speakers. Many of you have operated under the assumption that this 30-day review is an isolated disciplinary measure. You believe this is simply about correcting the toxic culture of a single regional branch. You are thinking entirely too small. I shared my screen, bringing up a massive, heavily redacted organizational chart. The scope of it made Marjorie Keene visibly lean closer to her camera, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read the blurred departmental titles. Varello Living Systems is currently preparing to completely dissolve its regional borders, I explained, letting the magnitude of the statement settle over the digital silence. Within the next 6 months, the entire corporate hierarchy is being flattened and merged into a single, centralized national structure. Only the most efficient, transparent, and highly profitable teams will survive this consolidation to form the new national leadership core. The rest of the divisions will be entirely liquidated. I watched the realization hit them like a physical blow. Delia Cross covered her mouth. Grant Mercer went completely still. This was not a simple performance improvement plan. They were standing at the absolute epicenter of a corporate extinction event. This department, I continued, bringing the focus back to their immediate reality, is currently positioned at a critical crossroads. Your performance over the next 2 weeks will not just determine if you keep your current jobs. It will determine who leads the entire retention strategy for the national company moving forward. Before they could even begin to process the scale of the opportunity, I dropped the anvil. However, you will not be making that transition under your current operational models. Last night, we received a final, formal warning from our largest enterprise client, the Hale Winter Collective. The name alone sent a visible shockwave through the grid of faces. Hale Winter was the absolute crown jewel of the Varello portfolio. Losing them would not just result in a bad financial quarter, it would trigger a massive domino effect, causing other critical enterprise clients to flee the platform in absolute panic. They have completely rejected the silent renewal path, I stated coldly, looking right at the executives who had stolen and mangled my original warnings. They recognize the friction loops for exactly what they are, and they have given Varello exactly 14 days to completely overhaul our member processing model. If we fail to deliver a transparent, ethical, and fully functional system within 2 weeks, they will terminate their contract entirely. This was the exact crisis I had warned them about months ago. arriving right on schedule to tear their artificial success to shreds. Marjorie's eyes practically lit up on the screen. In her twisted, politically poisoned mind, a crisis of this magnitude was not a disaster. It was a grand stage. I could practically see the gears turning behind her carefully maintained smile. She firmly believed this was her ultimate chance for redemption. If she could somehow salvage the Hale Winter account, she could bypass my authority entirely, go straight to the executive board, and reclaim her throne as the visionary savior of the company. Later that afternoon, my system flagged a private, off-network group chat initiated by Marjorie. She had gathered Delia, Grant, and Kelsey into a desperate digital huddle. "This is our way out," Marjorie typed, her words captured flawlessly by my continuous monitoring software. "Savannah is completely paralyzed by data. She is entirely too theoretical. She knows how to find errors, but she does not have the actual, practical street smarts to save a massive account like Hale Winter under this kind of pressure. We let her panic. We swoop in with a bold, creative solution, and we prove to Lenora Voss that Savannah is not cut out for the real trenches." She was utterly predictable. She assumed I was going to hand the crisis right back to the people who had originally created it, begging for their seasoned leadership. She was completely wrong. The following morning, I issued the official directives for the recovery project. I did not assign a single task to Marjorie, Delia, or Grant. Instead, I bypassed the entire traditional hierarchy and established a completely new operational unit. I called it the Recovery Cell. "Iris Boone," I announced during our morning sync, watching the young analyst sit up perfectly straight. "You will lead the data architecture for the Hale Winter overhaul. You have full clearance to build the new retention algorithms from scratch." Then, I pulled a name from the absolute bottom of the organizational chart. "Noah Tilden," I said. In the back corner of the regional office, a quiet, 30-year-old operations specialist looked up in sheer, unadulterated shock. Noah was the guy who fixed the broken macros, who quietly patched the software bugs late at night, and who had never once been invited to a creative brainstorming lunch. He was the invisible glue holding their broken, glamorous systems together. "Noah," I continued, my tone absolute and unwavering, "you are the lead implementation officer for this project. Iris will build the mathematical models, and you will physically code the new processing pathways into the client portal. You report directly to me, and you have unilateral authority to reject any design element that compromises the structural integrity of the system." The entire floor was plunged into a state of profound, disorienting shock. For the first time in the entire history of that regional office, the invisible workers, the people who actually understood the raw mechanics of the business, were pushed directly to the front lines. Meanwhile, the self-proclaimed corporate stars were officially benched, forced to sit in miserable silence and observe a rigid, unforgiving process they could neither control nor take credit for. Marjorie was furious, but she was careful not to show it on the official channels. She played the role of the concerned, supportive leader perfectly, repeatedly offering her strategic oversight to Noah and Iris, which I immediately and publicly vetoed. I mandated a total quarantine around the recovery cell. Nobody from the old regime was allowed to touch the new code. What Marjorie did not understand, what none of them understood, was that I was still holding back my most devastating card. Marjorie firmly believed we were simply fighting a localized turf war. She thought we were playing a high-stakes game of corporate musical chairs, battling over who would get the massive director title when the national merger was finalized. She was so entirely focused on the shiny prize of a promotion that she was completely blind to the actual trap closing tight around her ankles. I did not care about the title. Lenora Voss did not care about the title. The Enterprise Continuity Command had not been activated simply to see who was better at managing a single angry client. This was no longer a petty dispute about toxic management or stolen slide decks. It was rapidly evolving into a massive, federal-level investigation regarding the fundamental honesty of Varello's entire corporate reporting chain. The false numbers Marjorie's team had been feeding the board for the past 2 years were not just internal lies. They had been actively used to secure external funding and artificially inflate the company's public valuation. I was using the Hale winter crisis for two very specific reasons. First, the company genuinely needed to save the account to stop the bleeding. But more importantly, building a clean, highly functional system right next to the rotting corpse of Marjorie's old system provided the ultimate, undeniable contrast. I was forcing the executive board to look at the massive, terrifying discrepancy between reality and the beautiful fiction they had been sold. The bright blue frosted cake and the cruel jokes in that conference room felt like a lifetime ago. The sheer gravity of the situation was finally coming into sharp, terrifying focus. Anyone paying close attention would realize the undeniable truth. That pathetic little goodbye party had never been the main event. It was just a tiny, insignificant door that had accidentally been pushed open, revealing a breathtaking, catastrophic corporate collapse waiting just on the other side. And I was the one holding the match, waiting for the exact right moment to drop it. The ultimatum arrived on Friday evening at exactly 6 o'clock. It was not a polite request for clarification or a standard inquiry about operational lag. It was a formal legal notice delivered directly from the General Counsel of the Hale Winter Collective. They had conducted an independent third-party audit of their subsidiary user accounts and discovered a massive, glaring discrepancy. The customer retention metrics Varello had been enthusiastically reporting to them for the past 2 quarters did not reflect the actual lived experience of their users. The numbers were fundamentally disconnected from reality. Hale Winter gave us exactly 48 hours to provide a verifiable explanation before they initiated a catastrophic, highly public breach of contract protocol. Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. The main conference room felt like a pressurized submarine slowly cracking under the weight of the deepest ocean. The air conditioning was humming loudly, but everyone was visibly sweating. Marjorie stood at the head of the table, looking incredibly haggard, but desperately clinging to her theatrical instincts. She saw this crisis not as the inevitable consequence of her prolonged fraud, but as a final stage to martyr herself. "We are failing because the ecosystem has been actively poisoned," Marjorie announced, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion as she gestured vaguely around the room. "The new oversight mandate has completely shattered our natural creative flow. The team is paralyzed by fear. We cannot manage a high-tier client relationship when we are constantly looking over our shoulders, terrified of being punished for every minor statistical variance. The rigid auditing broke our momentum, and now the client can sense the absolute panic. You destroyed the culture, and now the accounts are collapsing." She was explicitly trying to blame the impending disaster on my structural review. She hoped the executive board would view me as a destructive, bureaucratic nightmare who ruined a perfectly profitable account by being too rigid. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage with her emotional theatrics or defend my process. I simply reached forward and connected my laptop to the main projector. "Let us look at the actual panic," I said quietly. The wall screen illuminated, displaying a stark, unforgiving spreadsheet of raw data queries. I brought up the exact quarterly presentation the team had delivered to Hale Winter exactly 3 months ago. "Grant," I said, pointing a digital laser at a brightly colored bar graph on the screen. "This slide shows a user satisfaction rate of 85% during the cancellation friction loop. You personally signed the approval sheet for this specific deck. Please explain to the room exactly which database you pulled those figures from." Grant swallowed hard. His expensive suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big. He stared at the screen, then down at his hands, his charismatic persona completely disintegrating under the harsh glow of the projector. "I just pulled the metrics from the consolidated dashboard," Grant stammered, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The data fields were already smoothed out when they reached my desk. I was operating under the assumption that the back-end team had verified the core numbers before the creative phase. Once you were removed from the approval chain, the pipeline changed. The data was smoothed." I repeated the word, letting it hang in the freezing air. "By whom?" The room instantly descended into a brutal, immediate state of cannibalism. There is absolutely no loyalty among corporate frauds when the fire finally reaches their desks. "Do not look at me," Delia snapped, her voice shrill and panicked as she glared aggressively across the table at Grant. I only formatted the exact spreadsheets Marjorie forwarded to my inbox. I was explicitly told to visualize the growth trajectory, not to audit the foundational math. Every single instruction to alter the visual hierarchy came directly from the top. Marjorie whipped her head around, her eyes wide with absolute fury as her most loyal lieutenant publicly betrayed her. "That is a complete fabrication," Marjorie hissed, her professional veneer entirely peeling away to reveal pure venom. "I gave you creative direction, Delia. I did not tell you to fabricate reality. And Grant, you are the senior client liaison. You took it upon yourself to paint those metrics in a favorable light to protect your quarterly commission bonus. Do not you dare try to pin your reckless account mismanagement on my leadership." They were tearing each other apart. The polished, synergized team that had stood in this exact room just a short time ago, toasting with fake champagne and laughing at my expense, was now a vicious pit of terrified animals chewing off their own limbs to escape the trap. While they screamed at each other, a small, discreet notification chimed on my private monitor. It was a direct message from Iris. "Look at the encrypted legacy folder I just dropped into your secure drive." Her message read, "I found it buried on a decommissioned local server." I opened the folder on my secondary screen, angling it away from the room. My breath caught slightly in my throat. Iris had not just found old meeting notes. She had found the absolute holy grail of corporate evidence. It was an archive directory containing the raw, unfiltered audio recordings of the initial strategy syncs from 6 months prior, alongside the very first, uncorrupted data export. It was the exact digital moment where my original warnings were explicitly acknowledged by Marjorie, and then deliberately, maliciously ordered to be buried and distorted. I had the decisive piece of evidence. I had the absolute, undeniable proof of premeditated corporate fraud. I could have projected that audio file right then and there, ending the meeting and their careers in one single, devastating stroke. But I kept my hand away from the keyboard. I let the screaming match continue. I needed them to keep talking. I needed them to put every single one of their desperate lies, contradictory excuses, and vicious accusations on the official, recorded transcript of this weekend meeting. I needed them to expose the absolute depths of their toxicity to a point of no return. If I dropped the hammer now, they might still try to weave a unified story of accidental negligence or collective misunderstanding. I wanted them so fractured, so deeply buried in their own conflicting perjury, that when the final truth exploded, absolutely no one would be able to spin the narrative or play the victim. The meeting dragged on for another agonizing 2 hours until they were completely exhausted, their voices hoarse, the room thick with the stench of broken trust and sheer terror. I formally adjourned the session, demanding their final written statements by Monday morning. They filed out of the room like ghosts, avoiding eye contact with each other, completely broken. I did not leave with them. I remained seated at the head of the heavy mahogany table, the overhead fluorescent lights automatically powered down, leaving the room bathed in the harsh blue glow of the projector screen. The reflection of the raw, undeniable data washed over my face in the quiet darkness. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small, plain cardboard box. Someone in the office had secretly left it on my new executive desk earlier that week. I opened the lid. Resting inside was the cheap, plastic cake topper from the party. The jagged red letters spelling out the words "Goodbye Forever" stared back at me. I placed it gently on the table next to my laptop. It was no longer a symbol of humiliation. It was a promise. The clock had almost completely run out. All the dirty secrets were hovering just a millimeter below the surface, and when the final hour struck, that promise was finally going to be kept. The ultimate reckoning arrived on Monday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. The executive boardroom on the top floor of the central headquarters was a masterpiece of intimidating corporate architecture, featuring a massive table carved from a single slab of black marble and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city. Sitting opposite the door were Lenora Voss, 3 senior partners from the internal audit division, and 2 national vice presidents who were actively selecting the leadership team for the upcoming corporate merger. Marjorie Keene, Grant Mercer, and Delia Cross were seated on the far side of the marble table. They looked exhausted, carrying the distinct, hollow posture of people who had spent the entire weekend desperately trying to coordinate their lives. Lenora called the meeting to order, her voice echoing coldly in the cavernous room. But before she could even outline the agenda, Marjorie launched her final, desperate offensive. She stood up, placing her hands flat on the marble, attempting to project the authoritative presence of a seasoned leader protecting her flock. "Lenora, members of the board," Marjorie began, her voice quivering with perfectly calibrated, manufactured distress. "I must formally protest the nature of this review. We are facing a critical, unprecedented crisis with our largest enterprise account, and instead of focusing on client recovery, we are being subjected to a witch hunt. Director Wright is utilizing her newly acquired executive authority to execute a highly personal, deeply emotional vendetta against her former colleagues. She is paralyzing our division out of sheer vindictiveness because she struggled to integrate into our vibrant team culture. If you allow her to dismantle my department, you are setting a terrifying precedent of weaponized management." She was playing directly to the inherent political fears of corporate executives, trying to paint me as an unstable, rogue element who cared more about settling old scores than protecting the bottom line. I did not interrupt her. I let her finish her entire impassioned speech. When she finally sat down, breathless and glaring at me, the room fell completely silent. The executives turned their attention toward my seat at the head of the table. I did not offer a lengthy, emotional defense. I did not mention her toxic culture or the daily humiliations I had endured. I simply opened my laptop and synced it to the massive digital display spanning the wall behind me. "Let us review the operational timeline," I said quietly, my voice entirely devoid of anger. The screen illuminated. I did not show them a narrative. I showed them a forensic autopsy. First, I displayed my original risk forecast from 6 months ago, clearly detailing the exact failure points of the silent renewal path. I pointed to the verified timestamp showing when I submitted it to Marjorie. Next, the screen transitioned to the doctored slide deck Grant and Delia had presented to the board exactly 1 week later. I highlighted the digital access logs, proving exactly when Marjorie's credentials were used to download my file, and when Delia's credentials were used to scrub all the negative projections. I moved methodically. I displayed the furious, unedited client feedback emails that Marjorie had actively hidden from the regional directors. I showed the internal spreadsheets where Grant had manually typed fake retention percentages over the actual failing numbers. Finally, I displayed the chain of internal memos where Marjorie had systematically blamed the resulting financial discrepancies on my technical execution, deliberately framing me for the very crisis I had tried to prevent. The 2 national vice presidents were staring at the screen in absolute horrified silence. The sheer scale of the deception was undeniable. "These documents prove a sustained pattern of data manipulation," I explained to the room, "but they do not fully capture the strategic intent. For that, we need to review the departmental archives from the 2nd week of October." I clicked a single audio file on my desktop. The sound of Marjorie's voice filled the pristine executive boardroom. It was crisp, clear, and dripping with arrogant impatience. "I do not care what Savannah's predictive models say about the chargeback ratios." The recorded version of Marjorie snapped through the high-fidelity speakers. "Her numbers are a roadblock. Delete the warning slides. We are presenting the optimistic growth matrix to the board on Tuesday." Then came Grant's recorded voice, casually sealing his own fate. "Agreed. Who cares if the system breaks down the line? We just need to fake it through this quarter to secure the regional bonuses. We will deal with the fallout later." I stopped the playback. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolutely final. Grant buried his face in his hands. Delia was visibly shaking, a single tear cutting through her perfectly applied makeup. Marjorie was completely frozen, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for a lifeline that no longer existed. Her entire foundation of lies had just evaporated in less than 5 minutes. But breaking them was only the first half of my mandate. The board needed more than just an executioner. They needed a leader who could rebuild the ruins. Identifying the fraud is insufficient if we cannot stabilize the resulting damage, I stated, turning my attention directly to Lenora. As of 8 o'clock this morning, the Hale Winter Collective has officially withdrawn their notice of termination. A collective gasp rippled through the executive side of the table. Even Lenora raised an eyebrow in genuine surprise. Over the past 72 hours, I continued, projecting a new, streamlined architectural schematic onto the screen. A newly formed recovery cell led by Iris Boone and Noah Tilden successfully deployed a fully functional, transparent member processing model. This new architecture was built entirely on the foundational risk assessments that were previously discarded. I presented the live demonstration to the Hale Winter Executive Board at dawn today. They were so thoroughly impressed by the integrity and efficiency of the new system that they have agreed to a 14-day operational extension to monitor the rollout. I looked directly at Marjorie. Her face had drained of all color. She finally realized the absolute depth of her defeat. I had not just exposed her complete incompetence, I had used the people she treated like garbage to save the most important account in the company, proving definitively that I was the only person in the room capable of fixing the system she broke. The collapse of the old regime happened instantly. Delia practically shoved her chair back, sobbing as she frantically announced she was resigning effective immediately, desperately hoping to avoid a formal termination on her permanent record. Grant began stammering wildly, pointing a trembling finger at Marjorie, aggressively claiming he had been blackmailed into falsifying the numbers. Marjorie did not say a single word. Her symbolic power had been completely vaporized. She looked small, hollow, and utterly defeated. Lenora Voss did not hesitate. The board officially voted to immediately dissolve the existing regional leadership structure. The security team was dispatched to escort Marjorie, Grant, and Delia directly out of the building. The board then unanimously approved my operational proposal. They retained the honest, hard-working core of the department. Iris Boone and Noah Tilden were officially elevated to senior management roles, finally receiving the salaries and authority they had always deserved. As for me, Lenora slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the marble table. It was a new employment contract. I was no longer the director of enterprise continuity. I was officially appointed as the president of National Continuity and Member Trust, taking command of the entire newly merged national division. Late that evening, after the corporate campus had completely emptied out, I drove back to the regional branch one final time. I walked past the darkened cubicles in the silent break room, heading straight for the main conference room. I stood in the doorway, looking at the long mahogany table. It was perfectly clean now, but in my mind, I could still see the bright blue frosting and the mocking printed memes. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the cheap, plastic cake topper with the jagged red letters spelling out, "Goodbye forever." I did not feel a sense of vindictive joy, nor did I feel any lingering pain. I felt a profound, quiet satisfaction. I walked into my newly assigned temporary regional executive suite and opened the top drawer of my heavy oak desk. I placed the plastic topper gently inside, resting it against my new corporate seal. It was not a trophy of my suffering. It was a permanent physical reminder of the exact moment my toxic colleagues had confidently unlocked the door to their own total destruction. They had thrown me a brutal, humiliating farewell party because they truly believed I was disappearing from the company map. But as I closed the drawer and turned off the lights, the ultimate truth finally settled into place. I had not been transferred into exile. I had been transferred to the exact room that decided who was allowed to survive in the end. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. Remember to subscribe to Boss Revenge Stories, like this video, and support me by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.